So, for the most part, I've been kind of insulating myself from the public as much as I can with the release of PoE2 to try to make sure that my opinions don't get super heavily biased. It's very easy to be like completely doom-pilled by a bunch of people who are just intent on being negative about a game before we even have time to really figure things out. If I'm gonna be negative, I'd rather come to that negative conclusion on my own instead of just, like XYZ person online feeding thoughts into my brain and then making my opinion off of someone else's opinion. I've tried my best to make sure that these thoughts are actually my own. This video is also going to completely ignore like specific character power imbalances. All of that's going to change over the course of early access, and it's pretty irrelevant to whether or not the game is actually good. I will talk a bit about broad strokes when it comes to like buffs and nerfs and such, because it is important to the process of early access, but whether or not there's like builds that are bad or builds that are good is not really relevant to my feedback, if I'm being honest. In talking about feedback, I do think that it's important when you are gathering feedback to give that you write down the things that you feel and you kind of go back and analyze them a little bit, because quite a few times in the prep for this video, I wrote down my opinions of things that I thought were bad, that I thought didn't feel good, and ultimately what it concluded with was me simply just not understanding the mechanic, and I did eventually overcome it. However, in that same like line of thinking, there are a few cases where the process of overcoming it still felt like a bit too arduous, like it was just a bit too much to deal with, so those have been left in. And lastly, before we begin, I want you to keep in mind that this is a feedback video, so there won't be a ton of specific positives here, because that isn't what I'm trying to focus on. Try to understand that I am extremely net positive on this game. I want to make that clear because I know that the comment section of these styles of videos will always be filled with negativity, because that's kind of just what drives humans to, act on social media. Negative feelings are always stronger than positive ones, and you can see this by looking at basically any social media or news these days. However, this is a feedback video, so let's start with feedback. Let's talk a little bit about balancing issues. I know that there are balancing issues in the game. They're absolutely here. Sometimes monsters are too strong. Sometimes zones are too long. Sometimes builds are way out of whack and do insane amounts of damage that they probably shouldn't be doing. Some mechanics maybe are a little bit busted. And I know it feels bad to have your build nerfed, but with this being early access and them telling us that they are going to be nerfing these outlier builds, it kind of feels like if your build is getting nerfed over and over and over and over again, that in some ways you're probably asking for it, because if you're constantly chasing the most broken thing at any given time, it's obvious that they are going to be hitting those things with the hammer, right? The thing that is causing the problems is going to be the one that gets hit. I think that nerfing these outliers is fine. However, what I don't think is fine is that this is meant to be a testing environment. GGG is wanting people to find these broken builds, and them getting popular is an important aspect of it. So I don't mind the build being nerfed, but I do think that for a net positive experience for both the people playing the game as well as GGG, there needs to be, at least during early access, some kind of payback or way for a build that gets completely obliterated or changed in some way for these people to play a different build without having to re-roll. This is a tough decision, definitely, because on one hand, you're going to get these players that feel bad because they're like not getting a free respec and they don't get to try a whole brand new character. But I feel like the people who are getting their builds destroyed are simply going to quit the game instead of trying to make a new build. And the people playing whatever builds and they don't really care what they're doing are most likely going to play the game no matter what. So the negative of these people feeling bad that they're not getting to try a new build for free is completely outweighed by all of these people that are chasing these builds just simply quitting the game instead, and we don't get their feedback anymore. We don't get their testing anymore. So I don't know how you fix it, but I do feel like if a build is so powerful and some mechanic specifically gets fundamentally changed or nerfed, those people either need to get like their ascendancy undone and allowed to choose a different one or something. I don't know what the answer is, but there needs to be some kind of thing implemented for early access. Now, talking about stuff that's in game, my character is in tier 15 maps currently. I'm working on like citadels and things like that. I'm working through the end game, right? I have done 4 ascendancy points. I'll talk about ascendancy in a moment. That's going to be a whole section here. I've made it to the end game, right? Like I've made it into what is considered like the highest or close to the highest tier content that you're supposed to be doing. One of my fundamental difficulties with especially the end game content is gearing. Now, I feel that gearing early on in the campaign and such, while it might feel like a problem, is actually not as much of a problem as you think it is, because learning the mechanics of the bosses and the monsters that you're fighting is way, way, way more impactful than the gear that your character has. I do feel that it is still a little bit tough, and the changes that they've made with like regals dropping more often and such are good, and being able to have more access to new gear more consistently is good, but it is not as big of a problem, I feel, as people probably are making it out to be, because the little bit that I have heard from people on like my personal Discord and like interacting with people in game and friends and such is that like they really dislike the early leveling process of getting the gear and everything together. I did not experience this personally at all, and I played through it in the harder version of it. So while I do feel that there's definite issues in the end game, the early game is more about learning, and I hope that they don't make it too easy to get gear in the early game, because it's better that you are forced to learn the mechanics of the game rather than just being able to instantly overcome it with gear. However, in the end game, this is a very, very different situation, because one big problem with the end game is that certain modifiers, you might notice, are very hard to get. If we look at my character, I have well overcapped on fire, lightning, and cold res, but chaos I'm struggling. When I am in maps in general, I actually avoid specific map types specifically because they have chaos monsters in them, and those chaos monsters just do so much damage that they one-shot me. One particular thing is like in these lost towers in particular, there are these base like Vol caster minions, and these minions are insanely dangerous, absurdly dangerous, because they have this big AoE chaos explosion on the ground. That ability just one-shots me no matter what I've tried to do, simply because I cannot get chaos res. Now, a way that I could get chaos res is if I could take these little runes out of my gear. I don't really see a reason why I can't just delete the rune in the gear and put a different one in there. I'm not even asking to get the rune back. I just want the option of deleting it. It can cost me currency to delete it. Just give me an option to delete it and be able to replace it with soul cores of Takati so that I can have chaos resistance on my gear, because almost none of the gear that I have found has chaos res, and realistically the only way to make chaos res gear is to use essences. Like using essences of ruin on certain pieces of gear, but then it doesn't even roll that high, and you still have to go through the ordeal of, you know, auging it and regaling it and exalting it. So it's not even like it makes it easier to get, because you still need tons of normal resistances, but there are these specific stats that are very, very tough to get in the end game. I don't know how you fix this. I don't know if it's a rebalancing of how many dead mods there are on pieces of gear, or rebalancing how common some of these rarer mods are. Whatever it is, it's very frustrating, and even myself as a trade player, now I am trying to buy gear and stuff, it's still hard and still seems out of reach for me. Another thing is that, I'll be honest with you, they really tried to sell the well mechanic. I still just think it's dumb. Like, I'm not gonna mince words here. I think the well mechanic is just kind of pointless. I never feel positive about interacting with the well. Anytime I interact with the well and I have some kind of like feeling in my brain about it, it's almost always negative, because I either go back into a map after changing flasks and then I'm like, oh, I don't have any flash charges. Guess I forgot to click the well, and it just feels very negative. It's not a big thing, but all of the stuff that they said about the well, I don't buy any of it, unfortunately. I just think the well's bad. Now, let's talk a little bit about the dodge roll. So the dodge roll in general, I have very mixed feelings on. I am kind of putting it more in the bad camp, just because most of the time that you play in the end game really does come down to mapping. And the dodge roll in general doesn't feel super great while mapping. The vast majority of the time, I feel while mapping that any time that I have to dodge roll, it puts me in a very negative circumstance. And I never really feel like I've benefited when I do the dodge roll. Almost always it feels better to just prep for the circumstance instead and not try to dodge roll my way out of mechanics, because even with the changes where they've made it so that you can push small monsters and you can get through enemies and such with the dodge roll, I never really feel like I am winning when I dodge roll. I feel like I'm getting more behind. The circumstances where you have to dodge roll is when you've got like a bunch of enemies surrounding you. So you dodge roll, but then the enemies are so fast that they just continuously surround you anyways. So you get more behind. And most of the time it's better to just have your character be a little bit more tanky and focus on actually just killing the minions that are around you instead of trying to dodge roll through them or dodge roll out of them. However, on the complete flip side of that, dodging during bosses is almost always a positive experience, except for a very few limited circumstances. When you are fighting a boss and they have some big giant ability that's coming at you and you dodge out of the way, it feels good. It feels impactful. It feels like you're interacting with the boss and you're dodging these huge giant swipes or slams or explosions or things like that. However, there's a few times in specifically the campaign in like Act 1 or Act 2 or Act 3 where these bosses, the problem that I run into is like the targeting on their slam happens so late into the animation that it is extremely hard to dodge, if not impossible for a lot of people. And while I feel that those kinds of dodges do have a place in the game, it's not in the first 3 acts of the campaign. It might not even be in the campaign in general. Because when a boss essentially just targets at the very last millisecond of its slam, it makes it so that you have this itty bitty tiny window where you can actually dodge, and that's probably a bit too much for that early in the game. That's something that can happen with pinnacle bosses or things like, you know, a tier 15 map boss that's got a bunch of like haste boosted mods or something on it. Like, that's fine. But in Act 3, Act 2, I don't really necessarily feel like that's a good place for it. In general, dodge rolling doesn't feel great in maps, but I don't really know that that's much of a problem. However, dodge rolling on bosses mostly feels like a positive thing. I mostly enjoy it and like it. Just maybe nerf a few of those bosses like swing animations very early in the campaign, because there's a couple bosses, like especially if you're trying to play in melee range, that are just absurdly painful. Now, let's talk about my actual biggest problem with the game. This is most likely my biggest complaint and my biggest piece of feedback here, is that the environment obscuring your character in this game is really, really bad. This does not feel fun at all. And one of PoE 2's strengths in comparison to its predecessor, PoE 1, is that in general, when I'm playing this game, I feel like I mostly have control over my fate. I feel like most of the time, like 90+% of the time, if I die or I get into a bad circumstance, it feels like my fault. There are some cases, of course, but these feel like outliers. These feel like things that aren't intended, where, you know, I kind of just get one-shot or, you know, like killed by something random in maps. But the vast majority of the time, and pretty much all the time in the campaign, I always felt like I was in control, except for when the environment obscured me, because I don't feel in control there, and it feels very out of place in a game that gives you so much control over the experience. You know, you're not getting these random one-shots from off screen. You're not getting these monsters that move at the speed of light in the first couple acts of the game that just suddenly show up, one-shot you, and there's nothing that you can do about it. You can't get away from them. It always feels like you sort of have options. Like, you can either try to add an additional skill that'll help you slow things down, or gives you some space between you and an enemy. You can, you know, learn to interact with dodge rolls. You can figure out that, well, I can't run into corners and put myself in a bad situation. I have to anticipate, okay, I need to move this way, even though maybe it's a little bit more dangerous right now, instead of just taking the safe way, which is backing into a corner immediately, right? Those kinds of things are learning experiences that you can get better at the game and get more skilled and have a better outcome. What doesn't really feel like a skill-based outcome is when my character is completely obscured and a monster is completely obscured, and it does like an AoE chaos explosion that I can't see the explosion, I can't see the monster that did it, and I can't see my character to avoid it, and then I die, and there's nothing that I can do about that. That does not feel good. I don't know what needs to happen, if it needs to make it so that there's like a circle around your character that kind of, you know, gives you like a little bit of an opacity filter so that you can always see your character and what's happening to it, or if this is just an intended mechanic, but either way, being fully obscured sometimes by the environment does not feel good at all. Because as you get into these maps with tighter layouts and more obscuring, this problem becomes worse. Talking a little bit about the map layouts and like the width of the tunnels and how tight these areas feel, during the campaign, it feels like this is all kind of taken into account, and most of the time there's not any outlier mob types or abilities or actions that enemies do that interact super negatively with the environment. In maps, this is completely thrown out the window. In the campaign, it seems there were like considerations for monster size or their abilities or things like that, and they don't do crazy things like make a tiny little itty bitty corridor that's about that big and then make a monster that's this big that can't go through it, so he starts freaking out and bugging. And that's a positive interaction for the player, but it doesn't look good and it doesn't feel good. It kind of rips you out of the game. And then also when there are monster types that have like these large stacking AoEs and such, having the corridors be so tiny a lot of the time, it doesn't feel great when you cannot move through enemies at all, because these enemies will either get stuck on that tiny little corridor and just spam AoEs in that spot over and over and over again, and you just kind of have to sit back and do your best to fight things. But if those enemies are intent on staying back and you are like a melee character, there's just really nothing that you can do. Or if your character can't pierce through enemies and they just kind of sit there in that little corridor and just spam abilities at you, you're just kind of screwed. This is so problematic to me that I specifically go out of my way to avoid certain maps that have these like really absurdly tight layouts that I really dislike. I feel like when you are intentionally avoiding specific mechanics or layouts or areas or such because they are more frustrating to deal with than anything, that's probably not a good thing. And if I had to give you a very specific example, there is a map called Augury, and this map in general, which I have attempted, I'm just gonna grab a very low tier map so that I don't have to worry about this, but I'm gonna show you exactly what I mean. Like, these monsters aren't gonna be a problem for me, but we're gonna go to this Augury and I'm gonna show you what I mean by tight environments and like getting overlapped by the environment, not being able to see. So this map is one of the worst design maps that they've ever done, in my opinion, because not only are there situations where your character gets like completely obscured and there's going to be monsters that, you know, take advantage of this. On top of that, these corridors are so tight sometimes that when there is a random very large mob type or something that has like very large, say like chaos AoEs or things like that, you can become completely obscured, you can't see what you're doing, and you can't really interact with it. But the actual worst offender in this entire zone is this right here. Mechanics like this don't have any place in the game, and I don't know how this made it past QA. It's probably one of those things where it was just like, oh, you know, well, whatever, we'll fix it eventually. This right here, this mechanic in particular, makes me never run this map ever. I have completely stopped running Augury 100%. If I can avoid the map in any way I do, I never play it. The reason for this is that I'm going to click this lever and I want you to see how long it takes me to complete it. So I'm trying to move, right? I'm trying to cast abilities, I'm trying to do stuff. Do you see how long my character is locked out for? You see how there's monsters attacking me? Now, on one hand, you could say, oh, well, you know, just clear out all the monsters around you so they don't come and attack you. That's fine, but the way that monsters work in Path of Exile is that you kill all of them, and then if you stand still for too long, monsters that are like 3 or 4 rooms away start running towards you. Especially if you're standing still, like I said. And then on top of that, if you happen to run a zone that has like ground effects, or you run into monsters with ground effects and just one of those little itty bitty tiny monsters from like 4 screens away runs and puts a ground effect under you, and you can't survive with just your life loss, you're just dead. And there's just nothing that you can do because you're locked into doing this animation for like 6 seconds. So this map in just as a whole is just showing like everything that I dislike about the map design when it comes to in-game stuff. because tight corridors, having the environment overlap your character and not being able to see it, mechanics that force you to stay kind of like AFK for a while, and you can't roll out of that mechanic, you can't like exit out of it, there's nothing that you can do, right? You can just sit there and you can just suffer. That's not really the only problem I have with in-game, is it's not really just the maps and the layout, because mechanics have problems here, like Ritual and Breach and all these other mechanics just really don't feel like they were designed to work in the way that some map layouts handle. Like Rituals spawning giant tornadoes that one-shot you, and they spawn in an area where you can literally only stand in the middle, so you have no way to escape the tornado at all. It just doesn't really feel like it's had enough playtime, and I'm hoping these are just balance problems that, you know, eventually will get hit because they focus on the campaign. But as of right now, it is a huge problem. I think that we are very lucky that the gameplay is so satisfying and the gameplay feels so good, because the in-game mapping experience is very genuinely not that good right now. There's so many problems with it that we are very lucky that the gameplay and the combat itself just feels so satisfying. Another one of the reasons why I feel like the in-game mapping system does not feel that great is simply because I don't feel like there is any reason whatsoever that once you hit maps and once you start scaling into maps that you are lacking in alchemy orbs and regal orbs. I am having to buy these on the currency exchange constantly to be able to continue mapping, and that's fine, but I do feel like it subtracts from the situation if we are not able to just have enough regals and have enough alchemies by the time we're in tier 15 maps to just spam, you know, 3 mod maps up to that point. It is very much so not the case that too many regals would make it so that like making gear is too easy. Regals are not the limiting factor when it comes to gear. Exalts are the limiting factor when it comes to gear. Essences are the limiting factor when it comes to gear. Regals, definitely not. If you don't give us enough alchemies to be able to roll stuff in tier 15 maps, at least give us enough regals that I don't have to go and buy like regals every 7 or so maps, because that's about what they cost per exalt. I do feel like it would be better if in higher tier maps we got an abundance of regals, maybe a decent amount of alchemies, because when you're getting to tier 15 maps, if you're not aware what you have to do, the maps you have to either alch and then hit them with 2 exalts to get a full like modded map, or you have to transmute, augmentation, regal, and then hit them with 3 exalts to get a full modded map. So every single map that you're doing, you have to spend all this currency to be able to do it, because otherwise you're not going to be able to sustain these tier 15 maps. They're just not going to drop enough of them realistically. And if they're not dropping, then you have to buy maps as well, which is also eating into your funds. So it really doesn't feel super great at the moment, in my opinion, with the amount of basic currency that drops. Exalts I actually think are pretty much okay. Like the drop rate of exalts is somewhat fine, but these earlier currencies, specifically like regals and maybe alchemies, I think they need to drop a little bit more in maps. The next thing we got to talk about is ascendancy. Ascendancy is a nightmare in my opinion, because the ascendancies themselves, in my opinion, are not that crazy powerful a lot of the time. Like there's definitely some good ascendancy nodes, but it's not like they are this insane amount of strength or power that your character is getting. And the difficulty in getting the 3rd and 4th points really genuinely does not feel like it's in line with the power that you're getting from it. Don't get me wrong, I think that the ascendancy nodes on a lot of the classes have some pretty strong power built into them, and having all 4 ascendancy points will make your character stronger. I don't think that a 4th ascendancy point should require something that maybe 5% of the population is even able to accomplish, and that might be stretching it a little bit. The 4th ascendancy point for ultimatum takes currently 3 10-wave ultimatums, and then you do have to fight a boss after that, and the Sanctum one is ridiculous. The difficulty of the 4th level of Sanctum is absurd for an ascendancy point. To give you an idea, the level of the zone is roughly equivalent to like a tier 15 map. And a tier 15 map boss, even with say 75% more life, takes me, I don't know, 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds at most to be able to kill. The boss of the 4th level of ascendancy feels like he has quite literally 100 times the amount of health as a tier 15 map boss. It is an absurd amount of health. So much so that people playing some of the most overpowered builds, like some of the minion builds and some of the like really super broken mechanics in the game, they are still taking a while with very good gear to kill these bosses. Can you imagine a random player just playing their own build, getting to their 4th ascendancy, trying to do it, and just getting absolutely dumpstered by these bosses? Especially in an environment like Sanctum, where you're more so worried about your honor than like your own character strength. I don't know. I feel like the difficulty ramping of these final points, like the 3rd and the 4th points, does not equal the amount of power that your character gets. I feel like in general in Path of Exile, a ascendancy should be something that you are completing before you're doing the very difficult content. It feels bad to feel like you have a large portion of your character's power gated behind something that, I don't know, 90+% of the population is just simply not going to be able to do. They're going to have to buy a carry for it, which feels really, really bad, to be honest. So this isn't even talking about it being forced behind Ultimatum and forced behind Sanctum, because a lot of people are simply just not going to like these mechanics. In Path of Exile 1, it was mostly fine because, you know, the trials weren't that bad. Like, going into lab wasn't that big of a thing to overcome. It was still somewhat difficult, but most people could do it, and it wasn't like some arduous, insane task where you needed crazy gear, a ton of skill, and all of this time spent to be able to get there, and money spent most likely to be able to get there, and maybe even some RNG. I can see those things happening at like top tier pinnacle bosses where, you know, there's crazy loot and other things hidden behind that, but not just like completing your character's ascendancy. The difference between power and difficulty does not feel correct here at all. Now, as I said, this is mostly a feedback video, but I do want to talk about some of the positives that I felt about the game, because you could very easily get the interpretation that I hate the game by watching this video. But I specifically said at the beginning of it that I am mostly positive on this game. It feels really good. The base of the game feels amazing. And I want to also end the video with positives so that hopefully you'll take away some kind of positive outlook about the game and not just an overall negative outlook about the game. Because I do feel like I'm 75 to 80% positive on everything that's in the game. On the passive tree, on the skills that you choose, just the character that you choose, defenses, utility, support, extra abilities, they all feel worthwhile to choose this time around. In Path of Exile 1, you had this problem where essentially it was like you choose the most overpowered defensive mechanics, the most overpowered offensive mechanics, and that's what the game is balanced around. That's all that you can choose. Taking like utility stuff or freeze or things similar to like stun, electrocute, those kinds of things, those kinds of mechanics felt really bad in PoE 1. If it wasn't just a nothing addition to your build, you basically never chose it. In PoE 2, you can do things like take entire sections of points that are basically just trying to get you area of effect for your attacks, because the area of effect on your abilities feels really good. Like, it actually makes you do more damage, it makes you do more clear, it makes you feel better. Taking modifiers like stun threshold equal to lowest of evasion and armor kind of impact your character a decent amount. Ailment threshold impacts your character a decent amount. Taking modifiers like movement speed and such, all of these things feel meaningful on your character and feel worthwhile to take. And of the same token, when it comes to, you know, support gems, I can take Glacial Bolt, and on my Glacial Bolt, I can use Magnified Effect and not feel bad about using Magnified Effect. It feels like it is a good gem to use. Most of this comes from the fact that there aren't that many damage gems that I can choose realistically, so this one is actually a good choice. And I know that some people felt really weird, and I was one of these people, about the one support gem per character, but it does actually make some meaningful choices that you have to do on your character, and it allows you to use gems that maybe you wouldn't use otherwise if there were like 5, you know, damage gems that were available for that skill. Because now I'm using like more freeze buildup and more area of effect on my main skill instead of just, oh, I'm just gonna use 4 damage mods, right? Like, I'm just gonna use 4 damage support gems, and then this one's also going to be a damage support gem. Instead, AoE feels pretty good. More freeze buildup feels pretty good. Being able to invest into these mechanics and not feel bad about it actually feels really good in practice. When I thought about it from the perspective of PoE 1, I was like, well, I kind of just want to do more damage, right? Like, I kind of just want to be tankier, right? Well, I have become tankier by freezing more things. I have done more damage by being able to overlap my Glacial Bolt, like ice crystal explosions more, right? Like, the fact that I can get these explosions to overlap more frequently means that I'm doing more damage while clearing. And scaling more AoE has made it so that not only is my Glacial Bolt larger, but things like my, I don't know, like Herald of Ice, it's considered an attack, and I have a bunch of attack AoE scaling, so I get more, you know, like spread throughout enemies and more screen-wide clear and such. It feels good. And then skill in this game feels like it's being more rewarded. If you're not aware, one of the biggest things about Path of Exile 1 is that knowledge was much more rewarded in Path of Exile 1 than skill was. Having the knowledge of how to build your character, how to make currency, what choices to make, what things to do was significantly more important than actually like learning how to be good at the game, learning how to be somewhat skilled in piloting your character. In Path of Exile 2, there aren't those just random instant one-shots from off screen where getting good at the game means having the knowledge of I need to just make my character this insanely tanky through XYZ mechanics to be able to survive those off-screen one-shots. Instead, in Path of Exile 2, if I see an ability coming at me off-screen, I can move out of the way of it, right? Because it's not so fast that it just instantly destroys me. I can see that a boss is going to be doing a giant slam, and once I learn what that giant slam is and I learn how to avoid it, it's no longer an issue for me anymore. In Path of Exile 1, sometimes it really genuinely just felt like some boss slams were just not really avoidable in certain circumstances. Like, you had to build your character to be able to handle them. Like, say Cirrus, for example, and the thing with the maze, right? You just had to build your character to be fast enough to be able to get out of that maze. It didn't feel like you could outskill it. I haven't ran into a circumstance in PoE 2 where it feels like I can't outskill a boss's ability. And then Path of Exile 2 as a whole, it's just like, the base of this game is so fantastic, and the reason why I'm so positive about this game in general is because almost all of the problems that I've displayed, that I've talked about in this video, are all fixable. Like 90% of them are easily fixable. They're small balance decisions or game decisions. Obviously, there's some things that are harder, like environments maybe not being tuned super well and not interacting with mechanics properly and such. Those probably are going to take more design and more dev time and more thought. But most of the changes that realistically need to be made are like number tweaks or like choosing what certain things can do, and they aren't going to require artists and devs and programmers and such to do extensive amounts of work. And then just the game itself, the art direction, the music, the sound effects, the feeling of the environments, the way that it looks, like the graphics themselves. This isn't the most graphical fidelity I've ever seen, but it's up there. The graphic fidelity is very extremely good. And on top of that, the environments are interesting and colorful and vibrant. And it's not just some gray, awful, you know, like deep, dark kind of thing. There's environments that are purple completely, and blue and green. There's so much variety in it. It feels like the world is alive and there's lots of things that I can do and experience and just take in visually. And on top of that, for like the first time ever in Path of Exile history, I'm actually kind of invested in the characters and what's happening and the story and everything. The cinematics and like listening to what the characters have to say and reading their lore. Like if you click these characters here, I've read all of it. Look at this. I've read every single bit. I've read all of it because all of it's super interesting to me. So it feels nice to be invested in a game, not just because I love the gameplay and I love the experience of playing it, but I also like the story and I enjoy the way that it looks and it sounds. The music in Path of Exile has always been pretty good in my opinion, but the music in Path of Exile 2 is just another level up. Overall, in the isometric ARPG space, the feeling that I get from this game is simply unmatched at this point. With some balance passes and all of the work that they do over the course leading up to full release, I feel that there is a very good chance that this will be a generational tier RPG on the level of what Diablo 2 did for like the isometric ARPG genre. Judging by their response to feedback that they've already done, the changes that they've already made, the willingness that they are to listen to players but not do everything that they want, is making me feel more positive towards us eventually reaching that outcome. Because even if a lot of other companies have abused the term early access by releasing full games and trying to say, oh, it's early access, so their design decisions and all of that are just, you know, like, it can kind of be swept under the rug and they can just change everything to meet whatever the players want. It really does feel like this is a early access game. It's not complete. They are actively still working on it. There is still a lot to do. And at this point, if there's any company that I trust to be able to do live game dev well, it's GGG. So remember, boys, like the video if you like it, subscribe to get more videos like this, hit that little notification bell, and I will see you all later, the gamers.